John Calvin, in his commentary on Genesis 36, so the previous chapter to this, which was, if you recall, the history or the genealogy, the Toledot of Esau, Calvin makes a really interesting statement. He says this. He says, it often happens that the wicked do good to the elect children of God, contrary to their own intention. And while their covetousness pants for present advantages, they promote the eternal salvation of those whose destruction they have sometimes desired. What's Calvin saying? He's saying that sometimes unsaved, unbelieving people who are rebelling against God and really don't have anything good to say or think or feel about God's people, sometimes they try to harm God's people. In fact, sometimes they seek what he calls here present advantages. They want to get an advantage over Christians, over believers, over God's people. And they will try to do that and manipulate circumstances to get advantages. And here's what Calvin says about that. When they do that, sometimes they actually promote the salvation of those they actually would like to destroy. They actually promote the spiritual welfare and good of the believers that they're opposed to. Right? So for all of their efforts to try to get ahead and get advantages, and for all their efforts to try to bring destruction on believers, Calvin says sometimes they inadvertently end up doing good. Now he's talking about Esau. Right? And in chapter 36, it's all about Esau. He's talking in his commentary about Esau and the fact that Esau left the land of Canaan and went to Mount Seir, where he settled with his family and he conquered there. But in doing that, Calvin says, Esau didn't do that because he had goodness in his heart toward Jacob. He didn't do that because he said, well, God chose Jacob, so I'm going to leave and get out of the way so that Jacob can have the inheritance of the land. He didn't do that for that reason, Calvin says. No, he was trying to get an advantage over his brother. So he went to a place where there was opportunity for him to gain the present advantage. And he did. I'm not trying to backtrack here, but if you look at chapter 36, Esau's kings and chiefs and conquering territory, and he owns a mountain, and he's got a kingdom. And what does Jacob have? Tents in a land where he owns nothing. Okay. That's the contrast. Esau wins by that measure. He gets all of the present advantages. But what he doesn't know and doesn't realize is that he's actually making room for Jacob and allowing Jacob to stay in the land that God promised. He is actually making room for God's plan to go forward inadvertently. That's what Calvin is pointing here. Now, what does that have to do with today's message? Well, it has everything to do with today's message. Because we saw last week, in the first part of chapter 37, how Jacob's sons, I picture them like trees growing in an orchard, right? And when you plant trees in an orchard, you cultivate those trees. You fertilize those trees. You care for those trees so that they will grow and produce fruit. Now, what kind of orchard did Jacob's sons grow up in? What kind of cultivation did they receive? Well, the orchard was an orchard of envy, of deception, of rivalry and hatred and violence. And they learned those lessons really well. Now, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. That's a saying that we have, right? You guys know that? And there's definitely some truth in that. Jacob and Esau grew up in a home that was filled with favoritism, with rivalry, with deception and mistrust. And what do we see in their children? Well, we saw last week, Jacob's sons were learning those same lessons for themselves, right? Jacob's sons learned deception and dishonesty from their father. We saw that. They watched Jacob and Laban, their father and their grandfather. They watched them back and forth. They saw them constantly maneuvering and trying to use deception. Remember Jacob doing the whole thing with the sheep breeding and trying to, That whole, if you remember that whole thing where he splits the rods and he tries to do, we don't even, it's like you read that and you go, what in the world is he doing? He's trying to manipulate the circumstances so he gets the better end of the deal. That's what he's doing. That's what Jacob is trying to do. He's trying to manipulate circumstances to get the best of his father-in-law. And what's Laban doing? The same thing, right? Oh, you can have all the sheep that have spots on them. Hey, boys, take the spotted sheep and take them out here into the desert. Get them out of the herd. I mean, that's what Laban was doing. He was being deceitful. So what do they learn? They watched their father and their grandfather, and they learn how to be deceptive. They learn how to be dishonest. Okay? Now, they also learned some things from their mothers. Oh, boy, they learned from their mothers. Well, they learned about rivalry. They learned about rivalry. They learned about mistrust. Now, the whole thing with Leah and Rachel, sisters. But you could not find two sisters who have a stronger rivalry than those two, right? Leah just absolutely despising her sister because Rachel was loved better. And Leah was so jealous of the way Jacob looked at Rachel. And you think, okay, Rachel has everything she wanted. No, the one thing Rachel wanted was children. And guess what? Leah is fruitful. She has children. And so both of these sisters just desperate for the thing that the other one has. And then they fight. And there's, the whole, you remember that story with the mangroves, if you remember that? And this whole thing about trying to manipulate, and then they treat that thing. They treat Jacob like he's a piece of meat. We're going to bargain for him. Like, who gets to have him tonight? They're like trading back and forth. I mean, this is just despicable kind of stuff. Guess what? Their kids were watching this. Their kids learned from this. Right? Now, they also learned some other lessons. And I haven't really brought these out exactly, but we're going to do that a little bit here. They learned some other lessons. They learned something else from Jacob. This is a bad lesson. They learned how to be passive by watching their father, Jacob. See, how was Jacob passive? Well, there's times where you need to take a stand. Jacob demonstrated that often when those times came, he was not willing to take a stand. He was passive when he should have been active. Okay, for example, they settled in the land of Canaan after Jacob returned from Padan Aram, and he wrestled with God and that whole thing, and then he settled in Canaan. And what happened? His daughter Dinah, she goes out wandering among the peoples of the land. And you think, well, why did Jacob? He's living in this pagan place of Canaan, all these people in all these cities that God has told them these people are corrupt, they're immoral, have nothing to do with them. I'm going to take away the land from them, and I'm going to give it to you because they have completely corrupted it. And yet, what does Jacob allow his daughter to do? Just go out and wander in the land. See the world. Right? No concern whatsoever for her. Totally passive when he should have been active. Then what happens? One of the princes of Shechem assaulted her. Now, we're not going to go back and read all this, but the text is really clear about this. Jacob heard about it and did nothing. Right? He allowed his daughter to go out. When the inevitable happened, instead of intervening and protecting her, instead of calling for justice, what does he do? Nothing. He does nothing. Then, of course, his sons found out about it. They were not going to sit by and let nothing happen. And so two of his sons, Simeon and Levi, took it upon themselves. They heard about this. What they do? They deceived the men of that city. They came in and they said, listen, if you guys will be circumcised, then we will intermarry with you and we'll share with you and we'll have good relationship with you. And the men of the city thought, hey, this is great. We can use this to our advantage. So they willingly endured that. And of course, they were recovering from the procedure. What did Simeon and Levi do? They stole into the town and they murdered all of those men. They didn't just go after the guy who had committed the crime. They killed everybody in the city, all the men of the city. Right? In their violent revenge. Okay. Bloodthirsty men here. And what does Jacob do about that? Well, other than complain to them about how they've harmed his reputation, he doesn't do anything. Later on, in chapter 35, we learn about Reuben, the oldest, who slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah. And again, what did Jacob do? It says that he heard about it, he knew about it, he didn't do anything. Now this, understand, and I don't want to go into all the details here, but in chapter 35, verse 22, when Reuben does this, he is not just committing an immoral act. It is an immoral act. No doubt about that. But he's doing more than that. He's actually trying to usurp his father's place at the head of the clan. That's the motivation for what Reuben is trying to do there. He is trying to say, I can rule this family better than my father, and I'm going to put myself in that position. And what does Jacob do? Nothing. You see, time and time and time again, Jacob is passive when he should be active. Now, it's true that after Jacob met the Lord face to face at Peniel, there's a change in him. But I don't think that his home was ever a place where godliness was taught. You know, you can't imagine this family sitting down for family devotions. I can't imagine these kids really seeing their parents pray or you know, meditate on Scripture or you know, do any sort of acts of worship in any meaningful sense. I mean, that's just not the pattern of this home. And so Joseph's brothers all grow up there. Jacob's sons, they all grew up in this home. And what do they learn? Well, they learn from, from their parents. Sorry. I thought I could get through. I was doing good. I won't shake your hand afterwards if you don't want. That's fine. If you're concerned about that. Anyways. But you look at Joseph's brothers, look at Jacob's sons, and we could conclude that they are just the product of the home in which they were raised. They're just doing what they've been taught. Some people might even go so far as to say they really didn't know any better. This was all that had been modeled for them. This was all the example that they had. This was all the teaching they had. They just were the products of their home. So what else could we expect them to do? So when Joseph, in verse 2 of chapter 37, when Joseph brought a bad report about the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, which were his father's concubines, we can guess that these men, who were these men, the sons of the concubines? Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. We can guess that they had learned some pretty bad habits by watching their father, their mothers, their brothers even. Is it any wonder that they hated Joseph? And I think the answer is no, it's not surprising, based on the home they grew up in, what they were taught. Is it any wonder they despised Joseph's dreams? No, not really. Is it any wonder they could not speak civilly to him when their father gave him that special coat, right? That signified that he was the chosen one to be the chief of the clan in the next generation. Again, the answer is no. No, that's not surprising at all. They hated Joseph. But it's interesting because Matthew, or rather in the Gospel of Matthew, you remember what Jesus said about hating in the Sermon on the Mount? He said, if you hate someone in your heart, that is the equivalent of committing murder in your heart. So then, is it any surprise that Joseph's brothers, when they get the opportunity to kill him, is it any surprise that they plot to do so? Again, it's totally consistent with everything we've seen so far. All right, look with me at verse 12. And we're going to start there, verse 12, read down to verse 20. Then his brothers, that's Joseph's brothers, went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. So he said to them, or said to him, here I am. Then he said to him, please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me. So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Now a certain man found him, and there he was, wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, what are you seeking? So he said, I'm seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks. And the man said, they have departed from here, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Now when they saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. And then they said to one another, look, this dreamer is coming. Come therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit. And we shall say, Some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. Let's pray now as we begin to look into the Word of God. Father, thank you for the message of truth that we have in the Word of God. Thank you that your Word does not sugarcoat things. It does not try to put a positive spin on things. But you simply declare things the way they really are. You reveal people to be the way they really are. And it's important for us to understand the depths of sin and the effect of sin in the lives of us, of our children, of our families. It's also important for us to see that even in the midst of great darkness and even in the midst of sin and surrounded by sinfulness, you are not impotent. You're not weak. You're not unable to accomplish your plan, but actually you're at work and you are bringing about the result that you intend. And so I pray that you would help us to see that in the Scriptures, help us to believe it, and I pray that it would bring a change in our lives as we learn to trust you in your providence in the world, in our lives. I pray that you help me as I speak. Lord, give me strength to my voice to be able to speak without coughing, but I pray also that you would help me to speak what you would have me to say, and that you would use me as your servant now today to minister the truth to your people. And I pray that each one would be receptive to respond to it in faith. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now we should note, and I think this is important for us to see here, there's a pretty striking contrast between Joseph's character and the character of his brothers. Right? His brothers are envious, they're self-centered, they're bloodthirsty, they're uncaring, they're dishonorable men. But Joseph is pretty much the opposite of all of those things. His father calls for him to go to see how his brothers are doing. And how does he respond in verse 13? Here I am. Okay? Just straightforward, quick response, quick to obey. Now, it's interesting because Jacob thinks that the boys are young men here are in Shechem, which is 40 miles to the north or something like that from where they're at in Hebron. And so he sends Joseph off to Shechem. But Joseph gets to Shechem and guess what? They're not there. Now, if you are a 17-year-old boy and your father has told you, go to Shechem and find your brothers, find out how they're doing, and then come back and tell me. And you get to Shechem and they're not there, you might conclude to yourself, I've done what my father asked. I'm going to go back home and tell Dad, nope, they weren't there. I know that this is a shock, but 17-year-old boy, and I don't mean to pick on any 17-year-old boys here either. No, I'm just kidding. But you know, a young man, you send him to go find something, right? Go to my workbench and find this tool and bring it to me, or go and and if he goes there and it's not biting him, when he may come back. Well, I can find it. Okay, he doesn't persist, right, in looking. But what does Joseph do? Joseph doesn't turn around and go back and go, sorry, I don't know where they are, Dad. I went, did what you asked. They aren't there. That would be fulfilling his obligation. Right? Joseph doesn't do that. In fact, what Joseph demonstrates here is, again, he demonstrates this character there where he goes to Shechem and he realizes the brothers aren't there, so he asks someone, where are they at? He's looking for them. He's searching for them. Where are they? The guy says, well, they've gone further north to Dothan. So now he's got 20 more miles to go. By the way, probably on foot. So this, he's already walked 40. He's got to walk 20 more, and he's got to walk the whole 60 back. I mean, this is a lot. And so what does he do? Well, he goes further north. And he continues to find them and carry out Jacob's instructions. So I think, again, what we're seeing, and I'm not trying to read into this, I think we see in Joseph here, we see this kind of character, this persistence, this diligence. Right? I'm going to carry out my father's instructions. I want to please my father. I'm going to obey thoroughly. I'm going to show genuine concern. Now, I would argue here, where did he learn these things? Where did he learn these things? Well, some of them we can see in Jacob's family. Jacob's not an altogether evil character. His family is not devoid of any good. Right? Jacob demonstrates some of these traits, working for Laban, Jacob did work diligently for his father-in-law, and his father-in-law actually benefited from Jacob's efforts. And Jacob talks about that at one point. He says, I sat out there in the cold and the rain. I sat out there at night. I had sleepless nights. I went searching for your animals. I cared for you. Jacob was not a lazy man. So some of these things Joseph learned from his father. But on the whole, we do need to remember that it's true, your family has a great influence on your character, but there's something else that's true, which is that neither your parents nor your siblings determine the outcome of your life. If Joseph proves one thing, I think it's that this whole debate between nature and nurture, you're familiar with that, right? Are we what we are by nature, or are we what we are because of nurture? Is it because of our surroundings? Well, I think we could conclude that debate is too simplistic. It's missing a couple of key elements, right? One is personal agency, right? You have a choice to make about what you're going to do and what you're going to be. But also, it's missing the grace of God. Because I think Joseph here is demonstrating the fact that in spite of all of the bad examples, in spite of all of the sinful things that were around him, he still made godly decisions. And he demonstrated godly character. And I think it's only by the grace of God that we see these qualities in Joseph. But here's the truth, right? You don't get to blame your parents for your sinful decisions, even if you grew up with some seriously bad examples. By God's grace, you can become a man or woman of godliness. That is possible, in spite of your upbringing, if it wasn't good. I think this is part of why Moses is telling the story this way, because remember, he's writing the book of Genesis to the Israelites in the wilderness. They've come out of Egypt. They're going on the way toward Canaan. He's telling them about their past, about their history. Why is he telling them this stuff? Well, because they have to admit that their ancestors are a pretty rotten bunch. And by the way, it's going to get worse before it gets better, okay? So hold on, because we're not done with the bad yet. We've just gotten started with that. But these Israelites, Moses is calling them to walk in obedience and faith. Listen, you can't blame your ancestors. You can't say, well, those people were corrupt, and therefore look at that. It's just who we are, how we're raised, can't help it. No, you can't do that. Right? Their ancestors' idolatry, immorality, even their own personal history of slavery in Egypt. Moses is not, listen, that doesn't define you, he's saying. Right? Those things don't matter. You need to trust God. You need to obey His word, regardless of past failure, regardless of the influences in your life. You need to trust God today. You need to obey Him now. And so Joseph, I think, is a real model. He's a real model for these Israelites to show them someone who walked with God in spite of his upbringing and in spite of his surroundings. Listen, Joseph did not have an ideal life. He didn't. He didn't have the kind of upbringing that would tend to inculcate strong, godly character. But Joseph was still responsible. And we see that by God's grace, these things are true in Joseph's life. And Joseph was willing to do what was right, even when everyone around him was doing what was wrong, and even when it cost him dearly. Now, Joseph's brothers, I think, took advantage of his submissive and obedient spirit, because they saw him while he was still a long ways off, while he was still coming to Dothan there in the north. And someone, I don't know which one, someone had the idea, let's kill him. Let's kill him. Let's dump his body in a well. There's all these dry wells out here in the desert. Let's kill him. Get rid of his body. They even came up with a cover story. Right? Cover story is, we'll tell our father that some wild animal attacked him and killed him. And no one will ever know. Right? We're 60 miles from home, which is, again, 3 days journey by foot? It's a long ways. We're far enough away, no one's ever going to find out. Just the 10 of us. We're the only ones. We'll kill him, we'll get rid of him, no one will ever know. They had a perfect story. Well, that's what they thought anyway. Now, John Calvin, it points out, I think, interestingly enough, he points out the stupidity of worrying about what the world thinks about us and then being careless about the judgment of God. Because they're worried about being found out by their father and the other people. And they're not thinking about God, that He is the one who is going to bring judgment in their lives. Now, they honestly thought, this is what they say in verse 20, they honestly thought that if they kill Joseph, they can prevent God's plan from being fulfilled. Right? Notice how they say that at the end of verse 20. We shall see what will become of his dreams. Right? This is why Calvin talks about the stupidity of this, because they make themselves stupid. And I don't use that, I know people don't like using that word sometimes. It's not nice to call somebody stupid. But these actions are stupid. Like, this is foolish to a really high degree. They've become ignorant in their thinking they can successfully defy God. But this is what sin does to us. Right? It makes us stupid. In fact, Paul says in Romans 1, it darkens our minds. It makes us become fools, even though we think we're wise. You see, they thought they were wise. They had a plan. They could work it out and no one would know, but they were fools. Because everything they were doing was not going to frustrate God's plan. It was not going to stop God's plan. In fact, the irony is, and this is what Alan Ross says, the irony is that instead of preventing Joseph's dream, the brothers actually became the agents of fulfilling it. Now that is jumping ahead a few steps in the story, and I'm trying not to do that. But the reality is, their hatred, their determination to kill Joseph is actually the first step in a process that's going to lead to fulfilling the dreams that Joseph had. And they have no idea. They think they're going to get rid of him. They think they're going to destroy him. But in fact, this is the first step to elevating him to the position where they're all going to have to bow down before him, just like God had showed him in his dreams. Okay. That's what I love about this particular part of the book of Genesis. It's just fascinating to see God at work. Now, the first step of the process here that they have set in motion is Reuben, the oldest brother, intervening. Look at verse 21. But Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, "Let us not kill him." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands, and bring him back to his father." So it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. Now, you might think, you're thinking here about what would happen. Reuben is the oldest. That means Reuben's the leader. He's in charge, right? He can call the shots because he's the oldest brother. You would be wrong, but you might think that. We've already seen that Reuben has disqualified himself from the position of leadership. He tried to seize control of the family from his father back in chapter 35. I can imagine that the brothers are all envious. I can imagine none of them thought very highly of Reuben trying to put himself in that position, trying to exercise control of the family. And so this is not Reuben taking control of a volatile situation. This is not Reuben leading the way. In fact, it's a pretty weak attempt of Reuben to try to talk them out of actually shedding Joseph's blood. And Reuben's logic, and I understand what Reuben is trying to do here. What he really wants to do, right, is he's going to sneak Joseph out and rescue Joseph. This is going to be kind of a behind-the-scenes action. But Reuben's, his appeal, his argument to the brothers is fascinating, right? Because what does he say to them? He says, listen, let's not actually shed any of Joseph's blood. Let's just throw him in the pit and leave him to die. That's what he's saying. Because then we're not responsible for having actually killed him. Think about the logic of that. That's like, Well, don't run him through with a sword, just strangle him. You don't shed his blood. Like, the end result is he's dead and you did it. If he starves to death in the pit or dies of dehydration or gets eaten by a wild animal because you leave him in a pit, well, he's no less dead and you were the ones who put him there. You're responsible for it. Like, it's hard to understand why the brothers would listen to this and think this is like a plan. Because what advantage does this give? Well, again, I think it shows a little bit of just the twisted perversity of sin and what it does to our thinking. That it would make them think that somehow, somehow if we just throw him in the pit and he dies with starvation, then we're not as responsible as if we stab him with a knife and kill him. It's like, well, at the end result, it's the same and you did it. You're responsible. But they're not thinking that way. And Reuben's plan, again, was he was going to try to rescue Joseph from the pit when the brothers weren't looking, and then return him to his father alive. And this, again, might seem to be noble at first. Oh, that's good. It's good, right, that Reuben doesn't want to kill him. That's a good thing. He wants to rescue him. He wants to return him to his father alive. That's a good thing, right? Now, yes, but what's Reuben's motive here? Okay, well, his motive is a little bit less clear. Okay? It wasn't so much that he cared about his brother or even about his father. Reuben seems to have thought that this could be something he could use for his own advantage. I think what Reuben, I probably can't prove this, but I think that Reuben thought to himself, if I can rescue Joseph and deliver him back to my father, and then I can tell Jacob about this plan, that he will forgive me for what I did, and it will put me back in his good graces because I will have rescued the favored son, Joseph. I think that's the thinking of Reuben. There's a little bit later in the chapter here that we'll mention that I think demonstrates that. But the reality is Reuben is really just like his brothers, acting in a very self-serving way here. This is still about how Reuben can get an advantage for Reuben here. He's not acting out of concern for his brother. The rest of the brothers go along with Reuben's plan for whatever reason. They capture Joseph. They take off the tunic that his father had given him and they throw him into that dry well and they leave him there to die. And then they do what any normal, heartless, cruel, bloodthirsty men would do in that situation. They sat down for dinner. Right? Because that makes total sense. Verse 25. And this is where the story takes, by the way, another turn. Verse 25. I'm in the wrong chapter. I don't want to read that one yet. Next time. Okay. And they sat down to eat a meal. Then they lifted their eyes and looked. And there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing spices, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. Then Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Then Reuben returned to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes, and he returned to his brothers and said, "The lad is no more, and where shall I go?" Now that very moment, when the brothers are sitting down for their dinner while their younger brother sits in the bottom of a dry well, but they're going to leave him to die there, and they're going to sit and have a meal together. In that very moment, an Ishmaelite caravan just happened to pass by. Isn't that convenient? Now, I want you to think about this for a second. Would that caravan have been there if the brothers had stayed near Shechem, 20 miles south, where Jacob thought they were? Would the caravan have met them? And the answer is no. You see, Dothan is on the trade route from Gilead down to Egypt. In Gilead, where all these spices and things were found, and they would be taken on the trade route down to Egypt. And Shechem's not on the trade route. The caravan doesn't pass by Shechem. Okay, so interesting. Would Joseph have been alive if Reuben had not tried to use him as a bargaining chip with his father? What were the brothers going to do to Joseph when they first caught him? They were going to kill him and dump his body in a pit. He would not be alive at this point in the story if Reuben had not selfishly intervened. You see, these little details of the story are examples of the unseen hand of divine providence, because God is directing the lives of Jacob's sons in order to bring about his perfect plan. Oh, and by the way, that's the fulfillment of the dreams that Joseph had. It's the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham. God swore by a covenant oath. Fulfillment of the promise to Adam and Eve of the seed of the woman that would crush the serpent's head. All of this is going to come to pass through Joseph and what he accomplishes, what he does. So all of this is God's doing. And then there's Judah. And Judah with his very strategic bit of greed. So he spoke up when he saw the Ishmaelite caravan, and he had an idea. Maybe we can find a way to profit from Joseph's demise. I mean, it's not enough just to kill him and get rid of him. Hey, why don't we come out of this with some money? That's Judah. What a lovely guy. And so he comes up with that idea, right? Let's sell him as a slave. And after all, verse 27, he says, he is our brother in our flesh. After all, let's not kill him. He's our brother. He's our flesh. Griffith Thomas, in his commentary, he points out the irony here. Here's what he says. He was not to be killed because he was their brother in their flesh. But slavery did not matter in the least, even though he was their brother and their flesh. Right? Don't kill him, but sell him as a slave. I mean, he is a brother after all. Wow. I mean, wow. The cruelty of sin, the willingness to profit from evil. Man, it's just, and the thing is, this is not new, but it still happens today. We're not any different as a society. Right? I remember a couple years ago an expose of Planned Parenthood clinics that were selling the remains of aborted babies. Maybe you remember seeing that, and there was expose video and all this kind of stuff, evidence, and all sorts of people were up in arms about it. And the reasoning is they're already dead. Why not at least profit from them? That's the same kind of mentality here. He's dead. We don't care about him. We're going to get rid of him. We might as well get paid in the process. That's the thinking here. It's gross. It's disgusting. It's vile. It's despicable. These are the ancestors of the Israelites here. Okay. By the way, this is a freebie. Judah, of all of the sons of Israel, right? Who is the really, 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 really famous person who is going to come from Judah? Okay, you jumped ahead in the story. Yes, Jesus. Whoa. Just wait till next week. Not next week, thankfully. 2 weeks from now. We'll talk about Judah some more. Ooh. Judah is not a very nice guy. Right? Judah is a really despicable character. Right? God is at work. And this is where it's hard to understand this, but God is doing something here. Judah is offering a despicable and inhumane thing here as a suggestion, and his brothers all agree and go along with it. And Reuben, even when he comes and he realizes that his plan to steal Joseph out of the pit didn't work, because before he could do it, they sold him. First of all, he goes along with it. No objection. But, and you notice that's where verse 30, he says, lad is no more, and where shall I go? I think that's Reuben saying, oh man, my plan didn't work. Now I have nothing. Right? Again, the problem isn't, oh no, my brother's sold as a slave. It's just, what's going to happen to me now? No. That's Reuben's attitude. Everybody, self-serving, very, very, very wicked. But we can't forget the cover-up. It gets worse. Can't forget the cover-up. Verse 31, and the conclusion, which is also important. Verse 31, so they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? And he recognized it and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. And he said, for I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and a captain of the guard. Again, I want you just to consider the depth of the cruelty and the deceitfulness of Joseph's brothers. To convince Jacob that Joseph was dead, they dipped his coat in the blood of a young goat. Again, I can't not mention that bit of irony here. Because remember when Jacob was trying to steal the blessing from his father, Isaac? His mother prepared some food. Remember what she cooked? Anybody remember? She cooked 2 kids of the goats and used that to deceive his father so he could get the blessing. And what do his sons use to deceive him into thinking Joseph is dead? They take a kid of the goats and they kill it and they use its blood. There's an irony here, right? Jacob is getting a taste of his own medicine. One of the lessons of the book of Genesis is that sin always bears bitter fruit. Listen, you can be forgiven. God is so merciful. God's mercy is astonishing in its breadth. He is so forgiving. But understand that the seeds of sin, once they are sown, inevitably produce a bitter harvest. There's no getting around that. And God is merciful, and I will even say this, that God at times spares us from the results and the consequences of our sin that ought to happen, but there's no such thing as sin that does not bring consequences. There's no such thing as getting away with it. And I don't just mean that God punishes ultimately in the end. He does, but I'm saying that sin always has consequences, and they're always bitter. Has Jacob been forgiven of his sins? I believe so. But man, does he taste the bitter fruit of what he has done and how it comes back to him. We need to see that. We need to be aware of that. This is going to be true of Joseph's brothers too. But here it's Jacob. Jacob receives this reward of his sinful behavior, and he grieves Joseph's death. The duplicity of his sons just astounds me. When they bring the coat to him, in verse 32, we have found this. They play dumb, like, do you know, can you tell us, does this belong to your son? I think that's interesting too. They don't say our brother. Remember, just a few verses earlier, Judah was saying, well, he's our flesh and our blood, our brother and our flesh. Now he's saying, well, is this your son's tunic? Kind of like, sometimes when a wife will, after she's really frustrated with the way the kids acted, and the husband comes home and she'll say, deal with your son. Okay? They're like, I'm not going to own that. Okay, that's on you. That's kind of what they're doing here, right? And again, it's just, they know, like, obviously they know this. This is just deceit. It's just cruelty to put this on their father. They're cruel. And then think about this. It gets worse because in verse 35, we read that the sons and the daughters all arose to comfort Jacob. And he refuses to be comforted. Stop and think for a second about who that is. First of all, this is the first mention of daughters in plural of Jacob. The only daughter we know of is Dinah. It's the only one mentioned by name. So it's possible that this is, it may be that he had other daughters besides just Dinah that aren't mentioned by name, or these may be the daughters-in-law. In either case, I think the daughters here probably don't know. They genuinely don't know what happened because they weren't there. Whether it's the daughters or daughters-in-law, they weren't. I don't think that the brothers went home and told their wives, well, guess what we just did today? I don't think so. So I think there's sincerity there, but then think about this. It says that his daughters and his sons arose to comfort him. These sons are the ones who have deceived him into thinking that Joseph is dead. They are the reason for his grief. Their lie is the reason for his grief, and they're trying to comfort him. This is so cruel, so deceitful, so wicked. for them to treat their father this way. They allowed Jacob to think that Joseph was devoured by a wild beast, when all it would take is one word from any of them of the truth, and their father would know that Joseph is alive. It's ironic because Jacob thinks that Joseph is killed by a wild beast, and in a way, he kind of was. Because his brothers prove themselves to be very beast-like. His brothers are the wild beasts that got hold of him and tore him to pieces. Again, the one thing that I want you to come back to as we think about all this, I told you this 2 weeks ago, I want you to just keep our minds here. The Lord is fulfilling His promises. He told the serpent in the Garden of Eden, I'm going to send the seed of the woman and he's going to crush your head. He said that. He told Abraham, you're going to be blessed. You're going to become a great nation. Your descendants are going to possess the land of Canaan. And Abraham, in you, every family in the earth is going to be blessed. He said, Isaac, all of the covenant promises I made to your father Abraham, I'm making to you too. He said to Jacob, all the promises I made to your grandfather and your father, I'm making those to you, your family. And then he revealed to Joseph and to his brothers that Joseph is going to rule over them one day, that he is going to be the chief of their clan. So we ask the question, could God allow Joseph's brothers to derail his plan by attacking Joseph and selling him into slavery? Could God allow that to somehow derail his plan? No way. And so Moses signals to us, I think in the last verse of the chapter, that God is not yet done with Joseph. The brothers, listen, we got rid of him. He's gone. We even made some money off of it. Dad thinks he's dead. Everything worked out perfectly. Except, where does Joseph end up? Think of all the places in Egypt Joseph could have ended up. I'm not like an expert on Egyptian slavery, but I'm thinking to myself, Joseph could have been stuck in the mines, digging till he died. Or he could have been some other slave labor, manual labor place where he worked himself to death in deplorable conditions. I kind of envision that, right? But where did Joseph end up? He doesn't end up in one of those places. He doesn't even end up doing any manual labor. He actually finds himself in the house of a man named Potiphar. Potiphar, we're told here, is one of the officers of Pharaoh who served as the captain of his personal security detail. Is that an accident? I hope you understand that nothing in this account is an accident. God did not have to tear open the heavens and perform some sort of miraculous feat to save Joseph. By the way, if we jumped ahead 400 years, God does, in a way, open up the heavens and do miraculous things. We call them the plagues in Egypt that he does for these people that Moses is writing to. He does that to deliver them from Egypt. But this point in time, no, God doesn't do that. He works providentially. He guides the circumstances of Joseph's life. He positions Joseph in exactly the place that he should be. Again, I think we can see Joseph serving in a way as the manager of his father's household. That's why his father sent him to check on the brothers. It's why his father gave him the coat, because he was the manager of the house. He was accustomed to that. And what we're going to find Joseph doing in Potiphar's house is the same things he did in his father's house. He was prepared for this. Everything about this is God designing a perfect circumstance to bring about His plan and His purpose. So, in spite of his brothers' evil thoughts toward him, in spite of their active attempts to get rid of him forever and prevent his dreams from coming true, they have set in motion the events that are going to bring those dreams about. One day, these men are going to literally bow down before their younger brother. Now, we should take to heart what we have observed about Joseph's father, about his brothers, we should take heart the character we've seen, their envy, their deceit, their cruelty, their selfishness, their taste for violence. Right? None of those things should be found in the life of a Christian. These are wicked things. These are wicked men who do evil, corrupt, immoral things, and we should never do the things that they would do. These have no place whatsoever in the life of a Christian. And if you, but there's something else though, I would say, if you trust the Lord, if you really want to serve Him, if you desire to obey Him and to please Him, there's a really good chance that you're going to be on the receiving end of some of those things. Right? There are going to be people who oppose the will of God, and they are going to do everything they can to hinder you living for Christ. In some ways, it's just inevitable in this world that you're going to be on the receiving end of that kind of wickedness, that you're going to experience the hostility of others. And what do we do in those moments? Well, again, we look at Joseph. We can see in Joseph a model here, an example. Absolutely. I think of the Apostle Paul talking about all the things that he suffered for the name of Jesus, being beaten with rods and with whips, being stoned, being shipwrecked, being hungry, thirsty, cold, naked. Paul talks about all these things. Or I think about our brothers and sisters right now in Central Asia, some of whom are being arrested. They've been beaten, they've been threatened, they've been fined for daring to gather for worship and share their faith with other people. And in the midst of all these things, it can be tempting to ask, where is God when I'm being mistreated? Where is God when people around me are doing wicked things and they're attacking me and I'm suffering because of other people's evil? Where is God in this? That can be tempting to ask that question. And I'm telling you that the Lord is at work. He's still at work today, just like He was in the days of Joseph. He's guiding world events. I mean, I can't explain it all to you. I don't know what He's doing in every detail of every situation. But you understand that a 3-year war in Ukraine is not surprising to God. It didn't catch Him off guard, and it didn't derail His plans and His purposes. God is still accomplishing His purpose, and He's doing it through the work of some really evil men. The hurricane that threatened to wash out North Carolina. It didn't happen by chance, and it didn't catch God off guard, and it didn't derail God's plan. God isn't up in heaven stymied thinking, well, I had a plan and now it's not going to work out anymore. That's not what happens. He is at work, even in the midst of those circumstances. Even if people are doing wrong, even if people are using those opportunities to get material, financial gain for themselves and to harm other people, God is still in control. He's still working there. And when that happens to you, right, when those circumstances, not just kings and nations, not just the great things, but even your life, right? Your spouse, your children, your coworkers, your neighbor, your car, your health. God is at work in those things to bring about His desired end, to fulfill the promises that He swore so long ago. He is still bringing those promises to fruition. Here's what I want to ask. Do you see His hand in the life of Joseph? Do you see that? Then believe that His hand is still working in yours. Let's pray.